Hello and welcome to the Screencast, which is dealing with the topic of the sociology of mental illness. So this is going to briefly go over the different areas and particularly the different sociological contributions that have come together to discuss mental illness. There will be separate videos that deal with the evaluation of these theories and these ideas, but to start with, I just want to have an overall screencast that looks at the different theories. So this screencast is going to look at the following areas. And the sociologists that have been highlighted here are the key ones that specification identifies and also would be expected of you in an essay if you were asked to talk about it. And we'll address some other areas that are important in looking at the sociology of mental illness, such as the contributions of the biomedical model, and also questions about what social patterns exist. So which genders are suffering from mental illness more, which ethnicities are suffering from it more, and then coming to a solution with a social realism view, which kind of looks at how we can understand mental illness in a holistic sense. Now, the biomedical model focuses on, as we would expect, the biological, physiological processes that go on during somebody's suffering of mental illness, and this means that it's focused on brain processes, chemical, hormonal influences, and some of the other physical symptoms that do tend to come with mental illnesses. It's overly cure orientated, which means that it has an emphasis on focusing on drugs and surgery and intervention from biomedical research, and therefore because of this it focuses on the medical elite completing the treatment, so we're talking about doctors here, and focusing that it should be treated within a medical environment, whether that's a doctor's surgery or a hospital. We should not, in relation to the biomedical model, they don't believe that we should be focusing on treatment in the community. Now there's a lot of text here, but I'd like to allow you to pause the video if you want to make some notes based on what we've said, and then carry on to the next sociologist when you're ready. Foucault is a good starting point for looking at sociology. He believes that medicine is a form of social control, and he talks about medicine in general before focusing, onto mental illness. But he believes that, there's certain behaviour that is problematic to society, and the medical profession work alongside other institutions in society, like the police force, to keep people who are problematic or who are different or who are deviant under control via a process of surveillance. And one of the ways that they do this is by having a powerful set of ideas, which Foucault calls discourse, that allows them to define what behaviour is abnormal and what behaviour is normal. And therefore, once they've created this definition, they're in a position of power in society. This controls people's behaviour, and you can do this via putting them into detention sentences or various other kind of treatments that allow the powerful to control behaviour. And this concept comes under the umbrella of the medical gaze, where society looks at you in relation to these medical guidelines and in a scientific way, and therefore this idea of the medical gaze means that in psychiatric hospitals, doctors are using these treatments based on the authority and the power and that they have, and use all the evidence that's come from science to justify the treatment of mentally ill people. And in the past, that would have involved putting them in asylums, and we know from the research and things that we've looked at in lesson how badly people in asylums were treated. But they've got away with it, if you will, in Foucault's eyes, because they've used it under the heading of science and the expertise that comes along with medicine. Saz focuses on taking this one step further and claims that psychiatry itself is fraudulent. He agrees with Foucault and understands that understanding mental illness is actually about power, and it's about social control, more so than it is about the biological processes that are going on in somebody's mind or body. And he talks about this idea that people who go against the norm are deviant because they are not contributing to the stability in society that perhaps the functionalists would suggest. And therefore, mental illness is a way, or a convenient way for society to deal with people who are deviant, people who are different, people who do not appear to go along with what the norm is. And a big issue here is that because mental illness doesn't have physical symptoms like something that like a broken arm would, or even a stomach ache has, psychiatry as a process or as a profession is fraudulent, because it has to guess what that someone's going through. You can't get into that deep level of understanding and that deep level of emotion to understand how that person feels. So this whole organization of psychiatry is completely fraudulent because it's a guessing game. So therefore, it's treated by Zaz as a label that's put onto other people who are socially disruptive. Now, that's not to say that all people who are mentally ill are socially disruptive, but we know that what can, in severe symptoms, it can come along with people who maybe disrupt the norm, whether that's through the kind of demands it's putting on the NHS, or whether that's through a more severe form of behaviour. So, Saz kind of concludes that actually mental illness isn't something that can be treated. It isn't something that can be cured, like the biomedical model suggests, because it's to do with the attitudes of other people and the fact that other people are labeling it in a way. Really, there shouldn't be a problem with the behaviour itself. We should accept that some people have certain symptoms, and that's their part of their individual, unique identity. But instead, the problem comes from the idea that other people are not accepting of what's going on. And Sheff extends the arguments that have been made by Zaz by dealing with, the concept really of the self-fulfilling prophecy that we've looked at again and again and again in sociology and all kinds of different topics. And he states that mental illness is used as a label. It's kind of a dustbin of bizarre behaviour. Anything that we cannot explain, we use the label of mental illness to kind of justify away the treatment that people are given, or justify the behaviour, because we can't make sense of it. We don't understand why people are not following the normal, in inverted commas, ways of being. And so we basically just, anything we don't understand, we put it in this bin and then label it as mental illness, and then that kind of means that society still continues to run in a smooth way. And Sheff argues that once you've been labelled, a process like the self-fulfilling prophecy occurs, and the stereotypes that you learn about people who are mentally ill from when you're a child, maybe you've seen on TV, or when these kind of phrases, these horrible phrases that are used like nutter or loony or loopy, these kinds of ideas come into play, and the patient has learned in society what it means to be mentally ill, and then goes on to live up to that stereotype, and also other people treat them in that way, in those stereotype expectations, which is how the mental illness is prolonged according to Sheff. And how people perhaps don't ever get out of that label. Now, Rosenhan deals with the ways that the psychologists and doctors are diagnosing people with these conditions, and is specifically focusing on the diagnosis and the diagnostic criteria of the DSM, which is the big book that is used by the medical professionals to determine whether somebody has a mental illness or not. And he was trying to find out, is this a valid, but is this also a reliable method to diagnose people? So he's done one of the most famous experiments in the sociology and psychology of mental illness, and put up some participants who are fake patients, pseudo patients, to go into local psychiatric hospitals in the US complaining of symptoms that they've got. They're hearing a voice that says empty, hollow, thud. And these are classic symptoms that we see maybe attributed to a condition like schizophrenia. So when these people are admitted to the hospital, the patients then stop complaining of that voice and act completely normally. And he found that it took a range from about 7 days to 52 days for somebody to actually be discharged from the hospital, even though their behaviour was completely normal, in inverted commas. They were no longer expressing these symptoms. And basically what this suggests is that as soon as you've been labelled in such a way, as soon as you've been let into a psychiatric hospital, that means you've been labelled as mentally ill. That means that as soon as that's been put on you, people then consider everything you do to be part of your condition. So, if people were taking notes, if the participants were taking notes, they would be considered as note-taking behaviour, whereas actually writing stuff down isn't that unusual. And everything that they did would be very much considered and labelled as part of a symptom, as opposed to just a normal behaviour. And this is suggesting that the reliability of diagnosis is not up to scratch and not where it should be. And Goffman again explores how, in an interactionist perspective, how those who are mentally ill, once they enter a psychiatric hospital, there's this process called the insanity role that happens, and you go into this role and you're stripped of your identity and you're stripped of who you are, and the career of this psychiatric patient begins. And so within here, subcultures begin to develop, and people live up to their label in various ways. Some people rebel, some people become institutionalized and cannot function without the institution. But all of the processes that happen within a psychiatric hospital make it much, much harder for that individual to then re-enter into society successfully. So he talks about the idea of a master status, and how once you've been labelled as mentally ill, that takes over your whole of your identity. And therefore, the behaviour that they're supposed to be curing in these psychiatric hospitals is actually making it worse, making it harder for that individual to return to normality. And therefore, if we link it to previous ideas that other sociologists have suggested in this debate, it's therefore continuing to be a method of social control. Now, you might want to pause to have a read of what we've got here, but there are three kind of patterns that we see in mental illness, and this is another area you could be asked to deal with in the exam. I'm just dealing with three sociologists here, but there's loads and loads of research out there to suggest that there are patterns. In terms of gender, Brown talks about the idea that women lead stressful lives. They're most likely to be in positions of poverty and debt and unemployment due to things like marital breakdown or domestic violence. And because of these things, women we see suffer from mental illness more, and normally linked to depression and anxiety, particularly if they're lacking social support. Lincoln Phelan are dealing with the idea that there's a really close relationship between low levels of income or deprivation and poor mental health, and various patterns and have been established where children who are from lower occupational parents are more likely to be diagnosed with some kind of conduct disorder, which links to antisocial behaviour, which is all linked to mental illness in the broader sense of the term. And Nasru deals with the idea that, you know, we tend to see that there are high levels in ethnic minority groups, but there are really high levels in Afro-Caribbean groups. And in comparison to other Black and ethnic minority groups, we can't just put this down to racism and discrimination, as that's one of the classic explanations as to why this is happening. Actually, there must be something else going on if it's that specific group that are suffering even more mental illness than other groups, and we need to understand why that is. As a solution to some of the kind of debates and different perspectives on what's happening with mental illness in society is a social realist argument. And that believes that we cannot understand mental illness with just focusing on the biomedical model. We cannot understand mental illness by focusing on the idea of the sociology of it, or the labelling process and the role that power plays. And instead, what we need to be doing is looking at us as a holistic person and understanding how our biological and social aspects of our life interact, and then perhaps manifest itself in a mental illness. Now, Gove, not Michael Gove, Gove sociologist, points out that actually many people are very unwell before receiving treatment. So we can't say that the labelling process is what causes and creates mental illness, because if people are unwell before they've even received any diagnosis or treatment, then they cannot be said that labelling's caused that. And what we need to do then is to look at environmental influences and social factors, as well as, you know, the biological aspect, to fully understand mental illness. I hope that's given you a good overall picture of the sociology of mental illness, specifically the sociological contributions from different sociologists and researchers. There will be a separate screencast at some point that looks and picks apart some of the evaluation of these theories and how you could address that evaluation in an essay, but I hope that overall has been useful.